Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in with us again for another edition of our Critical Conversation. My name is Jeremy Kirk. I currently serve as the Director of Diversity and Inclusion here, Lone Star College-Tomball. Very excited to have one of a trusted colleague here to take us through another critical conversation today. I'm very energized and excited. I think Margaret has always been a participant, if you will. I'm really excited to see her on the side of a presenter. Really excited and energized for this talk today. I know she is a wealth of knowledge, someone that I trust in this field of diversity and inclusion work. And so what I'll do, I will go ahead and get out of everyone's way. I will let Dr. Janie Filoteo introduce Margaret. And from there, we will go ahead and get started. Just kind of some ground rules again for the day. We just ask that you keep yourselves on mute, please. Actually, keep your videos off as well. We want to keep all the attention and spotlight on Margaret as she is the presenter today. Once we get done, or once she is done, basically giving y'all all the rich information that she has on this topic, we will leave a little time, and when I say a little, somewhere between the tune of 15 and 20 minutes for question and answer. So again, my name is Jeremy Kirk. I will kick it over to Dr. Janie Filoteo. She will introduce our speaker, and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much again for joining in.
Hi, everyone. So glad that everyone made it. And I have the pleasure today of introducing Margaret. For those of you who are not familiar with her or her work, I'm gonna even try to keep it serious too. I threatened Margaret that I was just gonna make up a bio for her, but I won't do that. So wherever she goes, Margaret Jelinek Lewis creates community professionally through volunteer work and over food with friends on campus, hiking in the Scottish Highlands, or kayaking on Danish canals. Margaret believes in embracing diversity, creating inclusive environments, and challenging cultural assumptions. She shares those ideals through promoting international education, teaching psychology, and engaging in community service. Margaret earned her master's and PhD in developmental psychology from The Ohio State University and a bachelor's degree in linguistics and cognitive sciences from Rice University. She is a member of the faculty at Lone Star College-Tomball, where she teaches general psychology, lifespan development, and human sexuality, and currently serves as the chair of the Behavioral Sciences Department. Dr. Jelinek Lewis also serves as the International Faculty Fellow for the Center for International Education on her campus, where she develops programs for international students, international education, and study abroad. Dr. Margaret, as her students call her, also teaches within the Honors College. Margaret's strength comes from knowing that any adversity will make a great story later. And on a personal note, I can say she has some fascinating stories to share. Today, she is going to be talking to us about learning styles, and in helping us rethink the concept of learning styles, this may help us lead to greater equity in the classroom. Learning styles and that label may limit students' concepts of how or what they can learn. And so dispelling this myth may serve to create greater equity amongst our learners. We will have time for questions at the end, but if there is something that comes up along the way, Margaret has given me permission to interrupt her to ask those questions. So if there's something that comes up, please feel free to put them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to mute myself. Margaret, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Janie. So this is a funny talk, not in content so much, but funny odd in that I am not lecturing on something that I'm an expert in. I'm not lecturing on prenatal development, which I was doing earlier today, or various fascinating parts of human sexuality, which, you know, you're welcome to attend those talks as well. But I had what was interesting for me and lots of fun about this is that I had the chance to research something that I'm not an expert in. And Janie and I were talking at the beginning, one of the beauties of doing that is that I was able to really focus. And I feel like so many of us during this fraught time of the past 2 years were not able to focus because we were distracted by just the fact of the pandemic, because we were possibly working from home, juggling other responsibilities. So it was a real privilege to be able to focus on this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start the PowerPoint. So that should be, is that working? Okay. Awesome. So let me get rid of this window. So, okay. All right. So this is me. So I first want to say, and as Janie pointed out, I always have a story. So this is the story that I'm going to start with. I come from a long line of teachers. Both my parents were teachers and 3 of my grandparents were teachers. So I was encouraged always to share the knowledge I had, even if that made people uncomfortable. Remember, I do teach human sexuality. And I could credit my father for this particular trait. So the reason I'm showing this newspaper from 1947, if you look in the center of the right quadrant, you'll see an article. Here, I'll enlarge it for you. It says, "Boy 5 nearly slays Santa." Little Ferry, New Jersey, December 18th. Little Billy Jelinek, 5, was closer to the truth than he knew when he almost broke up a Christmas party in the kindergarten at Wilson's school here by his greeting to Santa. "That's not Santa," he cried. "That's my mother. I know her eyes." Other mothers tried to shush Billy when they saw the cloud of doubt arise in the eyes of the 35 other small guests. It took the opening of gifts to get his mind off the subject, but he was right. Mrs. Josephine Jelinek, who was a teacher there, and my grandmother of Kaufman Avenue had offered to substitute for the Santa who had not appeared on time. So just as my dad called out the Santa imposter, so too do I feel obliged to dispel myths, particularly when there's evidence to support their debunking. So this talk came about first because I was in a professional development course on cultural communication when I came across the term learning styles, and I thought, why are we talking about learning styles in this course? There's no such thing. So there's the giveaway. So I very politely informed the teacher of what I knew about learning styles. And then I noticed that they're being spoken about everywhere. I noticed it in professional development offerings here at the college, in lots of conversations. And so that's why I'm giving this talk. So what are learning styles? And I'm happy for those of you who, especially I saw some of my colleagues in the Associates of Arts and Teaching, I'm happy for you to jump in and talk about how you do or do not use this concept. In general, we say that learning styles are the preferential way in which a student absorbs, processes, comprehends, and retains information. So the idea is that some students are going to learn better when the material is presented visually, where others will learn better when it's presented verbally. And what happens is we encourage students to study in a way that might match their learning style, but we also encourage teachers to tailor their teaching, to those students. And it partially comes from this idea that teachers want to think that they can reach every student, even struggling students, just by tailoring their instruction to match that student's learning format. So for us as teachers, if a student says, "I learn best this way," we think, well, my goodness, then let's teach you that way. I had a colleague just earlier today who said to me, "Students say what they need and I give them what they need." And I think a lot of us are in that position of saying, well, what do you need? What can I do to help you? And I'm happy to adopt what I do to help them. And of course, it sometimes happens that students blame their scholastic failures on the teacher's failure to align their teaching style with the student's learning style. So you have a funny back and forth between the student saying this is the way they best learn, and the teacher may or may not be able to cater to that. And then there can be a funny blame game. So I'm going to, I can't see the chat, but I'm going to ask you to raise your hands, and I'm going to trust somebody who can see the hands raised. How many of you learned about learning styles in some kind of teacher education or pedagogy courses that you had? I'm seeing some thumbs up. I only see a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to put some of our trainers on the spot. How many of you have ever talked about or taught learning styles in your classrooms? Yeah, okay, so I'm seeing some thumbs up there too.
Margaret, we have a comment from Dr. Nutt.
Okay.
That I feel like is key here. As a grad student research assistant, I helped a prof study learning styles.
Yeah, and you know, the good news, Dr. Nutt, is you don't have to throw your entire degree in the garbage. I know you'll be comforted at this point in your career to know that, but that's it. Like, it happens. This conversation happens across the board. It happens at all levels of education, right? So not just in elementary or secondary education, it happens here too. It happens in PhD programs, in grad school, right? This language is so pervasive that people who aren't even professional educators are familiar with those terms. So, you know, this has become common vernacular. So I'm pretty sure then that all of this is familiar territory. So I want to make one thing clear. In case you're curious, I consider myself a gustatory learner. I learn best through cooking and eating. Okay, I'm just kidding. Well, no, I'm not kidding. I really love food and I love to cook, but that's the idea, right? So in the most absurd case, how do we cater to the gustatory learner? You know, my husband's a geologist and he'll tell you that there are rocks, there's probably only one, that you lick to be able to tell what it is. That would probably be my favorite rock. It's a distinguishing feature, I should say. There was an article in The Onion, you know, the satirical newspaper, about someone being a nasal learner. And, you know, the joke was, well, you can't teach my kid because you're not teaching nasally, right? So people definitely poke fun at it. But really what we want to talk about what the problem is and why why the idea is problematic. So here we go. The first problem is that peer-reviewed empirical research does not support the evidence of learning styles.
Wow.
Was that a comment or was that somebody just with a mute issue? I'm happy for comments. Okay, so there are two parts of this. If you look at ERIC, the Educational Research Database, there are thousands and thousands of articles on learning styles that are available. Fewer than 25% of those articles were peer-reviewed, and far fewer were well-controlled studies. And that data comes from 2010, so there are probably even more studies at this point. So the published research about learning styles is generally not peer-reviewed. More importantly, the research that evidence that does exist does not support learning styles. The other interesting thing is we have this global term, learning styles, but even that concept is not well defined, and that umbrella, if you will, is used for many different ideas. The most common one is talking about visual, auditory, or kinetic learning. Others use things like activists, reflectors, theorists, and pragmatists. And you can imagine that these are hard to assess. They're hard to really categorize well. So that's a problem too. If you have categories that aren't well defined, they are harder to assess. There was a major report published in Psychological Science and the Public Interest, which is the journal of the Association for Psychological Science, in 2008. And the researchers were prominent researchers in the psychology of learning at the time. And they said that although numerous studies have purported to show the existence of different kinds of learners, such as auditory or visual learners, they haven't used the type of randomized research designs that would make the research credible. And that's where the problem is. So we can't claim that each of these categories of learners exist if we can't empirically define that they exist. So nearly all of the studies that claim to provide evidence for learning styles fail to satisfy criteria for scientific validity. If you were going to test the learning styles hypothesis, the idea that students learn best when they are given instruction in their particular style, you would need to classify learners into categories and then randomly assign the learners to use one of several different learning methods. And then they would need to take the same test at the end of the experiment. And if there is support for this idea that learning styles and teaching styles should mesh, then the learners with a given style, say visual spatial, should learn better with instruction that matches with that style. And of the very large number of studies claiming to support that hypothesis, very few use that research design. Okay, so that's problematic. And of the few that did use that kind of design, some actually had evidence that flatly contradicted the meshing hypothesis. Unfortunately, right, it's very difficult to assess, and so typically it is not assessed in a way that is valid in terms of research design. These same researchers said that it's undoubtedly the case that a particular student's going to benefit from having a particular kind of course content presented in one way versus another. So educators are really attracted to this idea, right? If we say, oh yeah, I can see it, when I changed the way I taught this, a student really responded. But we also know that for as many students who get lit up about the way we've engaged them, there are other students who that way of teaching seems completely useless. So the problem is that although yes, when we vary the way we teach, it can have a profoundly positive effect on our students. But the idea that there are these taxonomies in which we can categorize students, and that should dictate the kind of instruction we offer, that just is not supported by research. So, and I'm happy again for comments, but many of us will vary the way we teach, partially because it's more interesting that way. Once I had a 3-hour seminar and I said to my students, look, I can talk for 3 hours nonstop, but you don't want to listen to me for 3 hours, right? So let's do some other things, right? It's more interesting for us. It's more engaging for the students. So we certainly see that. But these categories should not dictate how we teach students. So I'm going to present some more research. The British Journal of Psychology in 2017 found that students who preferred learning visually, right, so visual spatial learners, thought they would remember pictures better, and those who categorized themselves as verbal learners thought they would remember words better. But what the research study found is those preferences had no correlation to which they actually remembered better later on, words or pictures. So all the learning style meant in this case was the student liked words or liked pictures better, but not what worked better for their memories. So, and I can hear, the argument, okay, so we can call this their preferential way of learning. Yes, you can certainly say that you prefer to get information in one way or another. But as educators, we also have to be concerned with what is most effective for the material that we're teaching. A 2018 study in the Anatomical Sciences Education Journal had a research study in which Hausman and her colleagues had hundreds of students take the VARC questionnaire. So VARC stands for Visual, Auditory, Reading, Writing is the R, and Kinesthetic. to determine what kind of learner they were supposedly were. And the VARC is one of the most commonly used questionnaires. The survey then gave them some strategies to see, that would correlate with their learning style. And what they found was not only did students not study in a way that seemed to reflect their learning style. So when they asked them, how did you study for this test? But those who did tailor their studying to suit their style didn't do any better on the tests than those who studied in some other way. So a non-congruous way with their style. So then as teachers, we should say, well, if meshing those two isn't helpful, then why are we attempting to do that in the first place? There was a 2009 article in the journal Neuroscience in which people said that they liked to think visually or verbally, and that they did try to think that way. So visualizers tried to create images in their heads to remember things, and people who claimed they were more verbal tried to form words. But again, they found that if you said you were a visualizer and I gave you pictures, you didn't remember the pictures any better than anyone else who said they were a verbalizer. So there was no difference in the outcome if you were given a picture, whether you said you were a visualizer or a verbalizer, right? So again, if we are, as educators, are concerned about remembering and retaining information and being able to apply information, this idea does not seem to pan out. The other thing I have to point out here is, and we know this as educators as well, not everyone is equally good at every skill. And we all know that. So we have different abilities, and that's not the same as different styles in the way learning styles is used. So some people read better than others. Some people hear worse than others. But most of the tasks that we encounter, the task dictates the learning. You can't visualize a perfect French accent. If you know what a perfect French accent sounds like, you can imagine it, and the word imagine implies visual, but actually what we're doing is we're hearing it. If you're a soccer player, you can do, I can imagine soccer, but that doesn't make me a better soccer player. In fact, I'm a lousy soccer player, right? I am a swimmer, but you know what? I have to get out of bed and get in the pool in order to get a good swim workout. Imagining swimming or reading about swimming doesn't do me any good. It might inspire me to swim. I read about a woman who swam the English Channel solo. That was really inspiring, although it's not on my bucket list, right? But it didn't make me a better swimmer. It just made me maybe get in the pool, okay? So those are some of the problems. I want to also mention, because this sometimes comes up with learning styles, is Howard Gardner's idea of multiple intelligences. And this idea came about in the 1980s. And he developed the idea because in the research on intelligence and intelligence testing, psychologists always had a G, a general intelligence score or level, or however they conceived it, but it was always general intelligence. And Gardner said, you know, people demonstrate a wide variety, a wide range rather of intellectual capabilities, from linguistic to social to logical. So can we somehow categorize those intellectual abilities? And he came up with 8 intelligences, right? So verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, visual spatial, musical, naturalistic, body kinesthetic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. And this idea, and it's still in all of our general psych textbooks, my colleagues, I saw a couple of my psych colleagues on the call, they can confirm that, right? We still talk about this. Here's the thing. Current research, such as neuroimaging, does not support Gardner's idea. And in fact, Gardner has said that was an old idea, and we know it's no longer applicable to how we understand intelligence. So what neuroimaging has taught us, let's talk about reading. And I actually was just reading a wonderful book on how the brain processes reading. Reading is not just a visual task, it is a whole brain task. And when we look at all kinds of tasks, our brain uses integrated parts. So reading involves language processing, it involves visual processing, right? Seeing the words on the page, attention, abstract reasoning, working memory, predicting, and that's just a few of them, right? And those of you who teach reading, and I'm really glad Donna Willingham is on the call, because I know that she's worked with literacy issues. All of those matter. So we know, for example, that when we have kids who are struggling with reading, part of the problem is a working memory issue. So if you're struggling disambiguating individual words, you've spent so much working memory. Working memory is your active memory, what you're working on right now. If you spend all your working memory, which is rather short, on just figuring out one word and then the next word and then the next word, you can't retain the whole meaning of the sentence. So by the time you get to the end of the sentence or the end of the paragraph, you forgot what the beginning was. So working memory is really important. Prior knowledge is important. It helps you maybe visualize what you're talking about in the story or understand the pieces of information that are being talked about. So for all kinds of tasks, our brains are integrating information from all parts of it. So there's not a reading part of the brain, there's not a painting part of the brain, or a swimming part. Yes, I'm using my arms and my legs, but there's so much more going on there, right? So now that we understand how the brain works, and because of neuroimaging studies, we really can appreciate that we can't silo any of our skills. Okay, I'm gonna take a breath here. Are there questions or comments? You notice there's a theme here.
There is a comment, and I hope I'm pronouncing the first name correctly. I think it's Dina, that she added in a comment. I believe it says people with brain injuries often have issues with working memory. So to your last point.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. Yes, right. So then we actually know even temporary traumatic brain injury, right? So if you fell, but you were able to recover, or people who've suffered concussions, they often have a hard time keeping track of what's going on. There's this feeling, actually, of feeling really scattered because you can't quite focus, and part of that is related to working memory. And of course, if there's a long-term brain injury, then that continues. And so again, though, you know, the brain is really integrated, and we sometimes forget that. And even those of us who teach psychology, we talk about the different parts of the brain, and we'll say, this part of the brain deals with this, and this part of the brain deals with that. And while that is true, we also know, and one of my favorite things to talk about with students is we can literally remove one of the hemispheres of the brain, and a person can still not only live, but function. It's been done. It's only done in severe cases of epilepsy. But the point is, the other parts of the brain take over the functions of the part that was removed. So it's not like we're removing a liver or a kidney, right? The brain is amazingly plastic. So it can compensate. And the brain uses for any kind of function, it's using many, many integrated parts. All right.
We have one more comment. Yes, we have one more comment. This is from Stephanie. And it's, if you're learning a new language and reading the words that are new, your explanation fits in with this, as it's hard to know what the passage is about when you struggle dissecting the words.
Yeah, right. That's a great example of that working memory issue. And if you can So we know from deafness, if you can hear the word, sometimes then you can make it make sense. Especially, I often talk to my students who are taking anatomy and physiology, you know, when there's a big long word and they're thinking, I don't know what that means. If you can take it apart and sound it out and you hear it, you think, oh, of course, I know that word, because you can say it out loud. We know with students, with people who are deaf, studies of reading in deafness, that if a deaf person can develop some kind of internal phonology. So it doesn't have to sound like what you would imagine it sounds like, but they can somehow develop an internal phonology so they can hear the words. They are better readers than those who don't develop that internal phonology. Now they're deaf. I'm talking people who are, you know, profoundly deaf, but they have some sort of auditory concept in their brains, right? So they're using the auditory parts of their brain, even though they wouldn't use it to say the word. So again, that integration of the brain. Okay. So I have to say, since I'm talking about the brain, I do have to say, I use all kinds of modalities when I teach my students, and one of them is that I sing to my students. And one of the songs I sing is actually a brain song. So I know, as many of us do, the more modalities we can teach our students, the better they are, the better chance they have to remember it. And I often explain to students, if you only have one way of getting that information, but I ask you on the test a different way, if you know how to spell it, but I ask you how it sounds, you might not be able to answer the question. Or if you know the definition, but I ask you for an example, you're kind of in trouble. And we know the way memory works. If we think about neural networks, if we have lots of ways of accessing the same information, the more likely we are to be able to access one or two of them and be able to remember it. So before you ask, I will do it. Here's my brain song. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, cerebellum, brainstem. And I do actually sing that to my students. But I don't for a moment think, well, the auditory learners will get this and the visual learners will hate me for it. They'll all get it. They all walk out of the class singing it. We know that the brain processes music differently than it processes spoken language. Thank you, Anju. So in fact, it's another way, it's another modality, but it doesn't just speak to musical learners. All right, so the important question then is, can I have my cake and eat it too? So if we give students multiple ways to access information, obviously your lessons will be more engaging, and many of us know this intuitively, but the students will be more likely to remember information when it's presented in multiple ways. And on the flip side, if we can provide students with multiple ways to demonstrate their knowledge and skills, it's going to increase their engagement, it's going to increase their learning, and it's also going to provide us as teachers with a more accurate understanding of their knowledge. So we're not only going to test them in one way. Some people freeze up at multiple choice tests, but they can write a great essay, or vice versa. You could ask them to sing the brain song. I don't. So we know that we want to certainly help students increase their strengths, but we also have to appreciate that we want to give students help them improve where their areas and needs for growth are. So in the same way, all right, so I'll give you a swimming example. I am really good at pulling, and what that means is I would have a float between my legs and I would just pull with my arms. My upper body is really strong. I'm not as strong of a kicker. So my coach could say, well, let's play to Margaret's strengths and let's let her pull all the time. Yeah, that would be playing to whatever we want to call that, right? That style. But it would be really doing me a disservice, right? Because it would never strengthen my legs, which actually need more work, right? So although learning styles is presented as let the students use their strength, we know as teachers, we also need to help them improve where they are not as strong. So certainly we can individualize lessons when we can, and not have a one-size-fits-all instruction. As my colleague said earlier today, it was Dusty Capistran, for those of you who know him. He said, the student needs this, I give them what they need. Outstanding, right? And that's what we should do, but not to the detriment of sort of coddling and not helping them improve where they need improvement. So, how can we present the material that's interesting, that's varied, and that's appropriate for that material? As I said, the French accent, you have to be able to hear it. You can't see it. Everyone is able to think in words. Everyone is able to think in mental images. So really what we should do is encourage students to have a toolbox of ways to think, and then be able to say, okay, which tool is best in this circumstance or for this kind of learning or for this subject matter? So the content should drive the modality. So instruction that's optimal needs to be guided not just by the material, but by the aptitude of the student, by their prior knowledge, right, what they already have in their toolbox, and the cultural assumptions that they bring to a learning task. So all of those need to be taken into account. And that idea of assumptions brings me to the issue of diversity. So often, learning styles are put forth as a way of saying, well, we need to cater to people's diverse needs. I would argue, though, that catering to learning styles in the classroom can actually foster a fixed mindset, not a growth mindset. So if you are of the mind, if you are of the opinion that you need to learn in a certain way, but I'm teaching in a slightly different way, right? I'm singing to you in the classroom, then you might say, but that's not how I learn. And literally, you'll step back. Well, then that's not going to allow you to embrace this other modality, right? And so in a way, we're constraining students, right? So learning styles can cement existing disparities because they create an avenue, they can create an avenue for learners to say, well, that's not how I learn. So if you label a student or allow a student to label themselves as a certain type of learner, it's not very different than allowing themselves to say, I'm a math person or I'm not a math person, right? Whether or not the underlying label is valid, it functions to limit what the learner believes that they are capable of and steers them toward learning situations where they don't need to push outside of their comfort zone. And we often talk about this in education, that the process of learning should be a little bit uncomfortable, right? If we're going to try new things, sometimes that's uncomfortable, and growing isn't always comfortable in a literal sense, right? Especially if you went through a growth spurt, a rapid growth spurt, but also in learning situations, growth is sometimes uncomfortable. So if we provide multiple options for accessing the material, we're certainly being more equitable. And therefore, if we do not label them as particular styles, but just say there are different ways that you can learn this information, you can access this information, and there are different ways that you can show me that you've learned it. We're really making the classroom more equitable. And when we talk about cultural assumptions and prior knowledge and things like that, and especially one of the hats I wear is as the International Faculty Fellow, when we talk about international students, we need to be aware of what their cultural assumptions are about how they can present themselves, how they do present themselves in the classroom, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. So we need to be conscious of all of those things as well. Certainly people differ in terms of their abilities in different domains. but catering to their strengths only can be counterproductive. There is research that shows that even people who believe that they understand things in one way, such as visually or detail-oriented, they perform better in their weak areas if they're given strategies to improve. So the best thing we can do is say, I know you might prefer this if the student expresses that, but this is how you might think about learning things in an auditory way or a kinesthetic way. And I'm thinking, I'm imagining a pottery wheel. You know, how do you feel the clay? And I once took a class in pottery. I discovered that I really don't have any innate ability when it comes to pottery on a wheel. But there's a different kind of learning there, right? And if I really wanted to pursue that, I would need to be uncomfortable for probably actually a very long time. Appreciate that yes, we should teach in a variety of ways and help students access material and study that material in a variety of ways, and understand that the kind of information also might dictate how we teach it. So our vision is the best system to take in things like data. When the material calls for it, you know, if we're in a music class or a language class, we need to be auditory learners. If you want to become a better swimmer, you can't listen to podcasts about swimming. You got to get in the pool. So, questions or comments?
There is a question. This is from Cynthia Galvan. Would you then support the sensory learning style referred to as VAK, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, to be best in promoting overall learning?
So you're saying, would I say that the visual learning style in the VARK kind of is the best for overall learning?
I think this is referring to a like something that combines the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic. So it's combining different styles of learning. If I'm understanding the question.
Can she unmute? I'm
she
happy
can't.
to.
She doesn't have a mic.
Okay, got it. So
yes, it's the learning style that's combined. So instead of just taking one, you're a visual learner, that the idea should be, let's combine, like for visual learner, auditory, kinesthetic, let's do them all together, and promoting that overall.
When it makes sense. And so, I mean, obviously then you say, well, I don't know, when does it make sense? It depends on the material and that person. But you know, I certainly don't think we all need to do calisthenics while we, you know, recite mathematical formulas. So yes, if we can provide things in multiple modalities when that makes sense, that's more interesting for learners, and it allows them, if we think of that, again, that neural net, it allows them to have lots of ways to access that same information. So in that sense, I would say yes, but I think we need to get away from, and so let me interrupt myself. So I think some of our people who have taught this might say, well, but that's what we've been saying all along. Teach in lots of different modalities so lots of people can access it. But I think the problem is when we categorize people, because that is limiting, and where I think it's a misplaced notion that by giving them a category where we're then going to be able to cater to all of those differences, when in fact those categories can be limiting in terms of intellectual growth, and therefore really affecting, you know, when we talk about diversity, right? We're not giving them the diverse opportunities that they need, and we're not taking all of those pieces into account. Other questions or comments?
We did have a question early on about whether you would be willing to share your PowerPoint.
I'll certainly share. I don't think you need the cake pictures, but I'll certainly share the references. Yeah, I will do that. And I'm going to see if I can be smart enough to stop sharing my screen. But I do want to point out that the chocolate cake recipe is one of my references. So, because, you know, that's important too. Right, so somebody, wait, I love this in the chat. So who said this? Harlan said, right, I still remember the preamble to the Constitution of Schoolhouse Rock. And this is a really great example. So we know that the brain processes music differently than it processes spoken information, to the extent that people who have brain damage in some of the language areas can still sing. And here's my favorite story, and forgive me, some of you might have heard this, but my sister's actually a music therapy professor. And she had a client at one point who, now I have to point out, she lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She had a client who could not say where he was from, right? Because he had aphasia, he had lost his language abilities, but he could still sing. So if you asked him where he was from, this is what he would sing. Who gives a damn about the whole state of Michigan, whole state of Michigan, whole state of Michigan? Who gives a damn about the whole state of Michigan? Because we're from Ohio. So then that's where he was from, right? He was from Ohio. And after a while in the course of therapy, he could get to the point of just saying, we're from Ohio, right? And then he could finally get Ohio, right? And the reason Schoolhouse Rock was so great is because it took advantage of this idea. So it was allowing us to access it in different modalities. And actually, when I was in 8th grade, we were supposed to memorize the preamble to the Constitution. And several students said, oh, well, can I sing it? And I remember even at the time being annoyed because the teacher gave extra credit to those who sang it. And I said, no, 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 they should not be getting extra credit because it's easier, right? It was easier to sing it than to say it. Right? For those of you who don't know, it starts, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, right? It was easier. They shouldn't have gotten the extra credit. I'm not bitter about it. It's okay. I passed 8th grade. But, right, it's that idea that we process it differently. So certainly give people all of those modalities and lots of ways to access the information. Just don't categorize the people, categorize the information. So are there other questions? Yeah, I love that people are saying like the Schoolhouse Rock was really a part of a whole generation of learning. And if you think about it, even if you would look something up in something as antiquated as a phone book and you couldn't remember, right, you might sing the alphabet song to yourself as you try to remember if K was before L or after L, right? So yes, music is quite valuable, but it's not the only, it shouldn't be the only mode. And it should only be the mode that we use when it's appropriate.
So you made me think of, so my sister's a 3rd grade teacher. And when we set up her room, right, at the beginning of the school year, she has to leave room for all the sight words.
Right.
And I was always like, this, like that's a terrible way to learn words because like you should learn them phonetically so you can figure them out. And I'm gonna get into, I know I'm gonna get my like teacher educator colleagues here riled up because so I have challenges with the sight words. So I'm missing something somewhere, but that's okay.
Right. No, actually, so this is interesting because it's going really into the category of reading. So the issue with sight words is the idea is that there are words that you should be able to know on sight, right, without having to sound them out. Longer, but you need both. And actually, there's really good research on this. And weirdly, it is such a contentious issue that I knew a researcher, I don't know if she's still there, but she was at the, she worked downtown in the medical center, and she did research on phonology, and she would get death threats for her research. I kid you not. What do you think? I love Alicia's looking at me like, really? So it goes back to the idea that some people believe you shouldn't be able to read yourself because then you can read things and know information on your own, for instance, the Bible. So there are really strong camps against phonetics. But what research shows is that we really need a combination of both. And you cannot, so for a while there was a trend in education that abolished phonetics and only had you learn it. It was called whole word reading, and only had you looking at whole words. And that was debunked by research. So the idea is you need both, and you can't become a proficient reader without having phonetics. And that goes to the research I was talking about with the deaf. We need to be able to sound words out. There should be some words that we can recognize right away without having to think about it. Because when we talk about the whole issue of working memory, if we're constantly spending time sounding out words, we're using up some of that working memory. So if we can recognize words just by seeing them, we're freeing up some of that working memory to figure out what the story is about, or what the whatever it is we're reading is about. So that's the idea behind sight words, but we absolutely cannot do it without phonetics. And Alicia pointed out that mnemonics are valuable in helping us remember information as well. The funny thing about mnemonics is sometimes people remember the mnemonic and not what it stands for. So thank you. Alicia said the strong movement against phonetics was during the whole language movement. Yes. And those students ended up understanding words, but were terrible at spelling or writing and following rules of grammar. Yeah. And that was exactly, so thank you for that adding to that, right? That was the whole issue with the whole language approach. And it was a disaster, but there are still people who are quite passionate about it. And as I said, this woman who was dealing with phonetics research literally got death threats in the mail, which is sort of absurd. That was about 20 years ago when I worked for her. So other questions or concerns, or I'd love to hear from people who either have advocated the learning styles approach or are uncomfortable with what I'm saying. If you're willing to.
Margaret, I'll share. It's Lacey.
Thanks, Lacey.
So, definitely going to jump in when you said uncomfortable with, right? Learning has to be uncomfortable, new experiences. And so, in the AAT program, we're preparing these future teachers to get out and be successful and effective teachers in the K-12 world, which still very much so is promoting meeting individual student needs, right? Through recognizing learning styles and multiple intelligences. And all of those comments are still alive and well in much of the K-12 world. And so students they come the first day of class and they're sharing their experiences, and they're already labeling themselves as a visual or an auditory or whatever you have type of learner. And so the conversation, at least in my classes, is usually, okay, let's talk about learning styles. Let's talk about multiple intelligences. Let's talk about other theories as well. And yes, you may identify as being a visual learner, but the conversation that you had earlier, right? As future teachers, you have to be ready to know those concepts, because whether you agree it's research-based or not, you're going to be expected to do it in the K-12 world, at least meet those student needs. But I have the same discussion with those students that you said, right? Labels are limiting. And just because you may prefer to get your content in a visual manner doesn't mean it's the only way that you can learn that content, right? And you also need to be ready to work on those areas that you need to strengthen, right? You can't just say I'm a visual learner. Well, guess what? You didn't do so well on the essay or whatever that you access that content visually. So let's try some grit. Let's use some growth strategies. And what other learning style or method can you try? So it's a very, I guess, I don't know the word is touchy, but it's it's tricky, right? Because I need to prepare them to hear those terms and know what they're going to be expected to implement in their future classrooms, but also at the same time, not have that limiting mindset. So definitely something I need to do some more research and digging on, because, you know, it's like I see both sides, and I'm kind of on this fence where I have to prepare you, but you also need to know the research behind everything.
I love that, Lacey. I have to say that while I was preparing this, I was really thinking of you and Laura Dupree, and thinking, okay, like I'm going to be talking to the people who are teaching our teachers, and that felt a little awkward. So it's really heartening to know that you're having both sets of conversations with them, saying, this is still out there and you have to be able to address it, but here's the way to be a good teacher and a good learner, right, in your classroom. That was really, really heartening. Thank you, Lacey, because I don't know what goes on in your classroom, right? That's the funny thing about having all these colleagues, is we don't know what necessarily happens in each other's classrooms. So I find that really encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And definitely has me ready to go do some more reading and research on my own. But, you know, it also goes along with UDL, right? If you're teaching them universal design learning, then you're also accessing as many modalities as you can throughout the course of any lesson. And so that's still good teaching. That's still effective teaching without necessarily the labels, because you're giving that access to all students in all modalities. So yeah, I think, you know, it comes down to labeling, right? And how it can be very limiting.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Mary, I noticed your hand is up. I don't know if it was up from before when I asked people to raise their hands, or if you have a question.
No, I think my hand's just up. Hold on for that.
Okay, thanks.
You know what? I will make a comment now, but you know,
Okay.
I remember, well, I'm like an old timer, so I've been around a long time. You know, in education, there's trends and there's new terms, and a lot of times they'll call certain things be the same thing, just call it something new. And so, you know, I think that like with learning styles, I think it was the springboard. I mean, I don't think we should just say, oh, this is, you know, throw all of this out the door, because I think it was the springboard that helped us to identify that students do have certain ways that they learn, and students don't learn in one way. And the more modalities that you offer them, you know, visual, you know, seeing it, hearing it, reading it, touching it, what we're actually doing is we're engaging them more with subject matter. And you're giving them more opportunities to interact with it. And that's usually how people learn, at least that's the way I learn. And,
absolutely.
You know, with me, if I find something relevant, if I can tie knowledge to something relevant in some way, then that's where those things I remember for the rest of my life. I mean, I can still remember things that I learned in college and see my professor at a chalkboard. I can still see him talking about this. I mean, I've remembered it all this time, but I enjoyed this presentation a lot. Sorry, I have my hand up.
Yeah, it's okay. Thanks for contributing that. I mean, I think that's, you know, finding it relevant is huge. And I know that, you know, I constantly try to make, and I think we all do this, we try to make the subject matter relevant to the students. Why are we learning this? My youngest child is a 9th grader. And we recently had a conversation, and he said, I constantly ask my teachers, what is this good for? And I said, no, sweetheart, let's try a different tack. How can I apply this material? It's a relevant question, and saying, what is it? You know, we had a little tact is important, but we know, right? The more we can make the material relevant, the more, as you said, Mary, the better you'll be able to remember it. One of my favorite stories, my maternal grandmother taught migrant workers' children in the summertime. So the deal was, this was in New Jersey, and the migrant workers would come through to pick fruits and vegetables. And at some point somebody said, gee, these children are not in school because they're constantly traveling to pick crops. We should give them an opportunity to go to school. So for 6 weeks in the summer, I think it was, my grandmother taught these children. And when they were learning math, so she was a musician, and so she taught them lots of folk songs and things like that. But when it came to math, they said, but why do we need to know this? And she said, well, if you're picking peaches for $2 a bushel, and you pick 7 bushels of peaches, you need to know if the foreman is cheating you or not. And she said, then they said, please teach us multiplication. Right? Yeah. What are we using this for? Why is it relevant? So that's the important thing, you know, helping them find the relevance.
Well, you know, your story about the mineral that you would remember, the one you could taste is halite. It tastes like salt.
Okay, there you go.
It's a salt mine near Tomball that I've actually been to. Like in my classes, I relate a lot of things to food. If you relate things to food, beer, and wine, you're sold. They are so sold.
Well, there you go. See,
reproduction.
A gustatory learner. I am definitely there. Yeah, and if there's chocolate involved, I'm even happier. Well, thank you, all of you. I really, I appreciate everybody's participation, and I really appreciate you coming. As I said, at the beginning, I enjoyed having the luxury of being able to do this research and the conversations with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Margaret, so much for all the valuable information. I now want some of that bundt cake, so thanks for that. And thank you for all of your participation. We will have our next critical conversation in February, so please be looking out for that, and we hope to see you then as well. Y'all have a fantastic afternoon.